welcome to you from all of us at WeCare. Dr. Mukadam has always been a friend. I've known her for almost 25 years now, more than that. And to say that, anything about her is really like you might feel it as a friend I'm saying, but I know that she's somebody who's passionate about palliative care and has always championed the cause of palliative care, not only in India, in Bombay, but also the whole of Maharashtra and in the country. And at every stage of her life, she has made sure that she learns more and more and more. And I think she's like totally involved in palliative care, and that is her passion. And her research work, you'll be surprised that she has more than 50 publications to her credit, and she's gone for trainings in India and abroad and whatever. So I can go on talking about Dr. Mukadam for the rest of the half an hour, but just suffice to say that she is really somebody who can work day and night if there is a palliative thing which has to be solved out. So she's our go-to person for everything that we need to find out about palliative care. We thought we will take this opportunity to learn more and understand more about palliative care. So we'll start with the first question, Dr. Mukadam. What is palliative care?
Okay, so the unfortunate thing in India is that palliative care is being equal to end of life care, which it is not. So the word palliative care actually stems from the word palliare, which is a Greek word which means to cloak. So, if you take a blanket and put it around the, around a patient who is feeling very, very cold on a, suppose a car breaks down somewhere in the middle of the night, and a total stranger comes to you and puts a warm blanket or a cloak over you, one would feel very comforted that somebody cares for you. So that's where the word palliative care actually stems from. It is to care for patient and family who require quality of life in any life-limiting condition. So be it cancer, where I know Vandana and WeCare has a lot of experience, but even in non-cancer, like neurological, cardiac, respiratory, even old age. So helping the patient and family to cope with an illness where the patient may not be cured, but the patient may live for years together, and to help them along that trajectory of the illness, the journey which the patient and the family is going through with its ups and downs, is what palliative care is about.
So I know you've already said that it's not the end of the life, but everybody thinks that once you become palliative, that means death is imminent.
Yes, so that is exactly the wrong way of looking at it, because death is most definitely not imminent. In it, like for instance, I told you about old people, geriatrics. So that person is not able to move in the home. The person may be having a lot of arthritis, maybe just can't get out of the bed in the morning, and even after getting out of bed has to hobble to the toilet. Needs all those aids, needs a walker, needs some, those electrical blankets so that they can be warm, so that when they get up in the morning, they can make it to the toilet without the help, because you know how each one of us wants to be as independent as we can. So even that is palliative care, just giving them a better quality of life, and which can therefore go on for years together. A patient can be in palliative care for over 10 years. And in case, let me just add one thing to that. I've recently started working in Shanti Avedna, and which is the terminally ill care center. But there are two patients there who have been there for, one patient for 6 years and one patient for 11 years. So that's the scope of palliative care.
So that means the care that has been given is extremely good for him to survive.
He just to go home. He's quite hale and hearty actually. I mean, he has disease in his lungs, so he does get extremely breathless. But the care which he's getting over there, the love and affection, besides the fact that he gets medications and good food, is what is making him feel that, this is my home. I think I'd like to be here for the rest of my life.
So since you brought about Shanti Avedna, which we know is one of the most prominent and eminent hospice in India, and it has branches all over the country like Goa and Delhi and other places. So what is the difference between palliative care and hospice care?
Okay, so it depends actually in which part of the world you are. In the United States, when they use the word hospice care, they actually mean all aspects of palliative care. So whether it is an inpatient facility, which is what the Shanti Vedna is, or it's a home care facility, which we have in our city also, and of course all over the country, we have Palcare, we have Romula Palliative Care Center, we have many home care services. So home care, taking care of a patient and family at home, taking care of in an outpatient facility like what we have in Tata Hospital. We don't have inpatient dedicated beds, but we do outpatient care for the maximum, or looking at a patient who's admitted in the ward, who is admitted under another unit, but we will go and visit that patient daily, and we will give them the psychological, social, spiritual care along with the physical care. So, most doctors and nurses are very well trained into giving physical care, whether it's pain or breathlessness or a wound or inability to move. But adding on the psychological, social, and spiritual care can be done in all those areas. So outpatient, inpatient, home, hospice, an inpatient unit like the Shanti Avedna. That's what is palliative care in the US. In the UK and in India, largely when you say hospice care, it usually means that inpatient unit for which the patient will go, when she or he is unable to take care of themselves. So just giving you two examples, there is a Cipla palliative care hospice in Pune, where the patients go for say 10 to 15 days to take care of their very severe symptoms, which the family members are unable to take care. They will be admitted, they will be taken care of, the family will be taught what needs to be done, whether it's medication or it's dressing or it's physiotherapy or it's care of the wound. Patient will be asked to go home, or rather I should say allowed to go home, so that they can be in the midst of their family for as much as they possibly can, and then come back to the unit to finally pass away in the unit as peacefully as possible. So in India, hospice means a place to pass away in as peacefully an atmosphere as you can, with family members allowed, because you know how it is. We all know in hospitals what happens is you have only visiting hours. Family cannot be with the patient for 24 hours. But in all the hospices all over the country and in the UK and even in the US, the hospices which they have, family members can stay, family members can be with the patient. Most of the time they won't do the end of, they won't do the cardiopulmonary resuscitation, because they know that whatever has been done has been tried. And let's allow this patient to die with the best possible quality of death. So it's quality of life and quality of death.
So what do you think? Is it better for a patient to stay in a hospice, or it's better for the relatives to learn and be with, look after the patient at home? Or, because very often we find that when patients are at home, it becomes tiring for the family to look after, and financial crunch also comes in, because they feel that they're spending so much money knowing very well that the patient may not recover for very long. So there are a lot of, psychosocial issues which come. So what would you advise somebody who is in palliative care, who needs palliative care, who's palliative, who's extremely advanced stage disease? How would you advise the family?
I think, see, to me, I don't think there can be one rule fits all. Absolutely not. So when the patient and family first come to us, we've got to assess the situation. Like as you rightly said, many of the patients who are in Shanti Avedna, for instance, they're living in a very tiny little home, and there are 10 people living in that home, and the patient is just not getting the place to rest. The wound smells a lot. So, the family members are all running out of the house, because, when the dressing is done, it's very difficult for the rest of the family. So in that situation, let's put the patient in the hospice. But when the symptoms come under control, then I think as we know in old folks' homes also how it is, the patient wants to be with their loved ones, because there's, it's a finite time. It may be a few days, it may be a few weeks, and even if it's months, it's still how much of love and affection can the patient be given in the most difficult time of their life. So I think it has to be fluid, and I think that the family members are scared. They feel that they will harm the patient when they do the dressing. They feel, I can't give the medication, I'm not a doctor, how can I do this? And the patient is breathless. As the amount the patient panics, the family panics even more. They just can't see that breathlessness. So it should be fluid. Let's put the patient in the hospice. Let's help the family members to learn what needs to be done. Let's show them that it can be made better, and you are part of that. You can also take care of your patient. Go home, come back. If you can go home again for another shorter spell, again maybe a week, please go, come back. We are always there for you. We will always take care of you.
I believe there are some principles of palliative care. Would you like to talk about that, Dr. Mukhadan?
Okay, so I won't use the word principles, I'll use the word goals. So basically in palliative care, because we are talking of life-limiting conditions, so I think the first most important thing that we need to emphasize here is that whatever curative options are there have been tried. They will be tried. Most of the patients who come to us would have had curative treatment and failed, or the condition of the patient is just too bad, in which they will be able to take a very toxic chemotherapy, or a very major surgery, or even radiotherapy with its very massive side effects. And therefore, like what we do in Tata, I think most people nowadays have been started doing that, is we have joint clinics. So all the specialists sit together and they all decide, let's try curative. If it's possible, try, fail, and that means that the patient has become incurable and is in a life-limiting condition, or comes with a very advanced disease to start with and therefore is in a life-limiting condition and not capable of being cured. And yes, I don't think it should be one doctor's decision. It should be a group of doctors, so that everybody is able to put their experience together and decide that this patient has a life-limiting condition. So once the patient has a life-limiting condition, then we're not looking at cure. We're not looking at how many months or years we can give to his life, but we're looking at the number of months or even a year, like I told you, 11 years with Mr. Gupta and Shanti Vedna. Let's see how much in that time we can give the best possible quality of life. So it's not about life, but it's quality of life. So first principle, let's give the best possible quality of life in an incurable condition. Now, in this, let us be as far as possible. Let us see that we believe that we don't hasten death, but we don't postpone it either. So we take life and death as a normal process, and we continue with that, so that in the time that is left for the patient, we will give the best possible quality of life. And in that, we will use whatever is available in the armamentarium. So palliative radiation, a short fraction of radiation, so that the pain can be reduced, or the tumor can be reduced, so that it's not pressing on the nerve and the pain is reduced, or the bleeding is reduced, or the offensive smell is reduced, or it's pressing on the spinal cord, and that will prevent paralysis. So radiation, stomas, people, I'm sure all of the people who are on this group know what's a stoma. So it is an opening which may be from the colon, which is a colostomy, or it may be from the stomach, which is a gastrostomy, or it may be in the urinary, if the urine doesn't pass, so that's a cystostomy. So, putting in tubes, openings, so that the patient can then their normal bodily functions can be done. So, or sometimes it's an amputation. Sometimes there's one lady who's there right now who has a huge tumor, and I'm trying to just see that she can get an amputation, so that offensive, smelly, painful, bleeding tumor is out of her body. These are all the treatments which we will use. We will use medication. We will use non-medical, like for instance, posture, acupressure, acupuncture, yoga, a lot of rehabilitation, whatever is possible to give them the best possible quality of life. And it also involves, as we said, holistic care. So it's not just physical, but it is psychological, social, and spiritual care to the patient and the family.
Okay. So these are the three things that you would like to focus on while caring for a person. Dr. Mukherjee, one issue that we have, uh, when do you really offer palliative care? And also let me add to it that, very often patients come to us with papers which say palliative care, palliative radiation, palliative surgery. And then some of us get a little confused in saying if it is palliative care and radiation and chemotherapy, is it something that should be helped financially, or is it already that the patient is in an advanced stage of the disease and may or may not be helped? So, the financial aspect becomes a trying thing for us to decide on whether it is like whether one should give the money for a person with palliative care, with palliative radiation, or to somebody who's a normal radiation. So that is a big dilemma for all of us. So if you can help us with that.
So the first part of the question was about when should we come in, and I think that that answer is very clear. Unfortunately, our doctors don't know that. So if any doctor is listening, please take note that we should come once we've decided this patient has a life limiting condition. So if you come in early, then you get that much more time. So when it's decided that these patients are not curable, then when they are being given palliative treatments, which I'll just repeat what I said of palliative radiation, palliative surgery, palliative chemotherapy, palliative hormonal therapy, palliative sometimes targeted therapies, which are expensive. So these are all treatments which will come in and will be used judiciously, not to cure the patient, but to take care of these symptoms. So the earlier that we come in, while the patient is going through that journey of cancer, then the patient also understands that, okay, I have an oncologist, but I also have someone who can support me for psychological, social, and spiritual care, who can support my family, who can help my family understand what's happening and cope. Coping doesn't come that easily with the oncologist, because their whole focus is on how can I cure this patient. So if we can work together, then they will help not to cure because the time has gone of cure, but they will help with the treatment, which will reduce the symptoms, and we will help with supporting with the psychological. We were talking about financial. So yes, there's a lot of financial help which needs to be given. We will talk of spiritual. Now, something spiritual is something, though we are a country like India, which is actually supposed to be an extremely spiritual country. But when you're sitting face to face in front of a patient, again, it's the same. The problem is that we have so many religions. Now, am I going to search for someone, someone from the Muslim community, or someone from the Hindu community, or from the Jain community? Am I going to call all these religious people and in the hospital? No, it's not going to work. So what happens is you or I, Vandana, you've been with us right from the beginning. You or I would then be that spiritual person. Irrespective of religion, we'll reach into the inner existential suffering and help to elevate some of that suffering. So the earlier we come in, once the patient has been diagnosed with a life-limiting condition, that's when we need to be part of the team. So the oncologist and the palliative care people are working together. Gradually, the oncology treatment is getting over, and the patient is more and more with us, by which time they've developed a rapport with us. They know that we are not there to harm them. We're not there because they're going to die and we're going to put them to sleep or something. They realize that because they see the kind of help that we give. The second part of your question is whether you should financially help such people. Let me just give you an example which I think works very well in Tata Hospital, where you have radical treatment for adults, you have radical treatment for children, you have palliative treatment for adults, and you have palliative care treatment for children. So it's a question of how much benefit is this particular individual who's coming in front of you and asking for help, how much is that person going to benefit? So the children, the tumors are more sensitive to treatment, and therefore the children should get better help because the tumors will respond to that treatment better than adults. So obviously the radical treatment for a child, and then palliative treatment for a child. Then radical treatment for an adult, because again, you are looking at, helping this person to have a normal life. But yes, there would be palliative treatment for an adult, which would really help that person to keep the symptoms under control for a prolonged period of time. For instance, let's take lymphoma, leukemia. The treatment would not be that expensive, and it would help the patient to reduce, like for instance, a spleen. I think most of the audience would know what is a spleen. The spleen has a lot of lymphoma deposits. It becomes massive. It becomes a huge, heavy thing in the abdomen, and just either oral chemotherapy or just a small dose of radiation will make the spleen shrink, and 50 to 80% of the patient's symptoms will be just gone away. So it's not hard and fast, and that's why again I'll come back to what I said about a joint clinic, where if many people put their heads together, which should also include not just the doctors, but somebody, a social scientist, maybe somebody from the social work, or someone like from your organizations who are the ones who are actually giving the money, all put our heads together and decide on each individual merit.
Okay. So tell me that when there's somebody on palliative care and the patient is at home, for example, in the hospital, you all are there to take care of the side effects. But if the person is at home, then how does one manage the side? What are the expected side? I mean, of course, it's difficult because everybody would be reacting in a different way and everybody would have different side effects. But some of them would be common. And so what are those common side effects and how does one manage those side effects? Can you hear Dr. Mukardan? We can't hear you.
I think there's some issue with her network.
Oh.
I hope that I'm audible.
Yeah,
let me just put it this way.
Dr. Mukardan, we can't hear you. I think, yeah. Can you put on your speaker, please? Yeah.
Hello. Yeah, hello.
Yeah, we can hear you. I think there's some network issue, Dr. Mukardan.
That is on. Now, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
So let me just say that it's different. Each person's chemotherapy is different, and therefore the side effects would actually be different. So I think before one tries to explain to the family what to expect and how to manage, they need to have a good session with the oncologist, because each chemotherapy drug or each organ in the body which is getting the radiation, whether it's whether it's the spinal cord or it's the brain or it's the chest, the side effects are going to be different. And therefore, it's good for the family members to have a good session with the oncologist to understand what to expect. Because once they know what to expect, then it's not difficult. Most family members are able to take care of their patients, and they are able to take care of the side effects as long as they have. I think it's good to give them something in writing, in the language of which they understand, and in as simple a way possible, so that when they are in difficulty, they can look up that piece of paper which they're getting. But they should also, I think, be given a contact number of either the oncologist or one of us who's supporting the oncologist, so that if they still find that they can't manage, okay, there's severe vomiting, patient is getting dehydrated, they just don't know what to do. And we don't encourage them to come back to the hospital because it may be very far away and there's never a bed available. They'll be sent back. They'll feel most distressed about it. So contacting the local general physician, speaking to the general physician, what can you do? For instance, just giving IV fluids even in the home, so that, if it was just that one bout of vomiting which caused so much of just giving the IV fluids at home will make the patient feel so much better, and he doesn't have to then travel, long distances to reach the cancer hospital. So I think prevention is, by them knowing what to expect and how to manage it, is better than waiting for something to happen and then having to deal with it. I don't know. Make it clear what I said. I'm not sure.
No, it's fine. We understand that every cancer will have different side effects. Every treatment will have different side effects. But it was just that, very often people begin to have an issue in looking after the person who's on palliative care. And so so you do have a home team, right? Who goes to visit the patient?
We have, in fact, 4 home care teams, and there are many more now in the city. Mumbai city has now got a Mumbai Palliative Care Network, which you'll find if anybody looks it up on the Facebook, it's there. The Mumbai Palliative Care Network is there on the Facebook. It has the names of all the units which belong to that group. But more important to that is the fact that we try to induct the local general physician. Like wherever the patient lives, whether it's Vikhroli or it's Kalina or it's Kalyan or wherever it is, we try to look for a local general physician, someone who the family is already familiar with. And we talk to those physicians. So these home care teams, most of them, ours 100%, but I think even the other home care teams, they go and meet up with those physicians, either in the clinic or over the phone or whatever, and give them basic understanding of what we want them to help us with and what we do not want them to do. For instance, we don't want someone who is dying to reach a private hospital and land up in the ICU. If we know that this patient is dying, then the best place for the patient to die is actually at home. And in fact, in our home care, we have published a paper which is about 70% of our patients are dying at home, which is quite a good record, because that means that the dignified death, which I spoke about in the beginning, is actually a reality. It's not just talking from a textbook, but it's a reality. So if the patient is prepared and the family is prepared, and it's so much more beautiful, dignified death if it can happen at home, surrounded by the family members. And I'm sure my husband won't mind me saying that this is exactly what happened with my father-in-law 3 days ago. He passed away very peacefully at home, surrounded by his family, in his own bedroom, which he had been occupying for 60 years or something.
Yeah, I'm sure he must have felt very happy about that. So that was a good thing to happen. Good thing to happen in the sense he was at home. That was a good thing.
A dignified death, because that's what he wanted. He always said that I want to die at home. And we were able to make it happen with the help of the local general practitioner. That's the thing. I live very far away from his home. So with the help of the local general practitioner, who was just 2 kilometers away, in spite of COVID. In spite of COVID, she still was able to come. I don't know what are you here. She was still able to come. She used to come every day, give instructions, do little whatever needed. She gave an IV one, for a few days. She gave him IV. She looked after his catheter. She looked after his. He didn't live long enough to develop bed sores, but the prevention of bed sores, she was taking care of. She did all, whatever needed to be done with my help. So, that's how it works. We instruct the local general practitioners, and they, carry it out.
Yeah, it is really heartening to know, like you mentioned, that there are people who are going and doing home care besides Tata, because earlier, there was only one Tata, and obviously it can't reach to so many patients all over the city. Now, if you have more, and thank you for telling us about this group which is existing on Facebook. One can always get in touch with them.
Absolutely.
And you said the Mumbai network
they can contact. Care? I'm sorry?
Okay. No, what was the name of the group you said?
Mumbai Palliative Care Network.
Mumbai Network?
Yeah, Mumbai Palliative Care Network.
Mumbai Palliative. Okay, so that is good to know. Now, I know it's difficult, but there are times when children also get into that stage when they are in the advanced stage of the disease. And it must be very difficult for the parents to cope with that, and also for the children. So it's both the situation. One is when the children are left and the parents are in the advanced stage of the disease. And the second thing is when the children are in the advanced stage of the disease and the parents are there. So how do we manage that?
Well, I mean, when the parents are advanced, then I think we have in our department, and I think many of the other centers also have a, a trained child psychologist. Not psycho, I mean, what we call them are counseling psychologists. And most of them are trained in how to care for children. So, actually children are basically in my, and I've got 25 years of experience. So I'm just not, just talking through my hat. Of realizing that children are actually way more resilient than what parents think they are. So parents try to hide, from children. Now, when I was just in the beginning of my career, when I was not in palliative care, I remember the husband of one of my very close friends passed away. And tradition was you don't take the children to the burial ground, because children will be upset and they should not know about what has happened. They will be told their father went on a long journey, but actually this child was only 6 years old, I think. And as he grew up, I honestly feel that both the children, the younger girl whose father died when she was a baby, I think they always kind of yearned what happened to my father, that kind of a thing. But when you actually speak to children, even as young as 10 and 12, they have the concept of death. They do understand from the age of 8. It is known that children can understand the concept of death. It's a question of how you, speak to them. So the one thing I'd like to make clear right from the beginning is that we don't tell them that your father is very sick and is dying or has died, but we try to understand from them. So, talking about breaking bad news, whether it's the child or it's the adult, involves asking, what do you know? And what would you like to know? And once you realize how much the child or the, even I'm here by talking about the children, so how much the child has actually understood, and because the counseling psychologist is trained, so she kind of knows, or he or she knows how to take that discussion forward. And honestly, any of us who actually sit on those interviews get amazed to understand how much the child actually perceives, understands, and does not deserve to be kept, outside the door, like my closed doors, which you can see in the background, and not be part of the discussion. It's a question of coming down to the level of the understanding of the child, and you realize that children are way more resilient than what we think. And children are for the present. Yes, they will miss their father or their mother for now. They can bounce back way better than than adults, and therefore their lives will carry on, and it's way better for them to have this openness that the father is gone and he's never going to come back again. And when it comes to the child, well, then the parents really suffer. It's very difficult even after so many years in in the area of children's palliative care, that when I have to counsel a parent, I can't do more than 2 or 3 in a session. It's just too difficult, because the parents are just absolutely broken. And I really think that we have no business saying, I understand how you feel, because we can't understand how they feel. They are absolutely broken. And there's really, I think, nothing that we can do besides just being there. Being there for them and not saying, I understand how you feel, because we don't understand how they feel. That amount of that absolute existential suffering which they go through, we can only just be there for them, and be there for them for a prolonged period of time. So they'll sit with you maybe for an hour, maybe for 2 hours, and you sit and don't fidget and allow them to express all the anguish and the pain which they're going through, and then still be available at the end of a phone. Make sure that if you give them your number, that you will be available to them when they want to speak. And that unresolved grief, which we call abnormal grief, will go on for a much longer time with the parent after the child has passed. And we have to still be available to them in the form of either an individual counseling or a support group counseling, or any other forms of counseling for those parents till they are actually able to go on. And one more thing which I find really useful is when they create their own groups. I have a friend who lost a child to cerebral palsy, and she created a group. And I think that was her therapy, was actually to create a group of parents who were losing children to cerebral palsy, because then they were able to relate to each other and they could find a meaning in their suffering by being able to talk to each other.
So one question has come that if the patients are from Tata only, then they will be given the Tata number, right? Not otherwise.
I mean, see, in our department, we don't take only Tata patients. We take patients from all over. Anybody who has cancer and who has advanced cancer and is life limiting, we accept patients from. So if the patient wants to be taken care of by us, they can come and register with us. They don't have to be treated in Tata. And that's to all the other. Sorry.
So any non-Tata patient can be looked after by the Tata palliative treatment.
They can come and
they can approach the Tata hospital.
Yeah, they can come and become a patient of the palliative care service.
And they will all be given the numbers of the doctors whom they can get in touch with and all that.
Yes, absolutely, yes.
I think it's some network issue with her now.
With her, okay. So, do you want me to talk about anything till we get her back?
You can just continue with it. I'll just call her till then. Yeah.
Okay. So I'm going to just okay. Vandana, can you repeat your question? Okay, you're on mute. Can you unmute yourself?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
No, I was only reiterating the fact that people can come to Tata Hospital, get registered in Tata Hospital, and then seen by a Tata doctor. And also at that time, they will be given the numbers of all the Tata doctors who they can contact, right?
Yes. So actually, what we do now, we have what we call a helpline. There is a dedicated number. There are actually 4 dedicated numbers which are given to every patient when they get registered with us. They get a card. So I'm reiterating that any patient who is not under treatment in Tata Hospital can come and get registered in palliative care service, and then be part of the home care, the helpline. The helpline, we have 4 numbers, dedicated numbers, which they can call up at any time.
Even during the COVID times, people can call up those numbers?
Yes. Actually, in fact, they're more useful during COVID times, because in the COVID times, very few people can actually reach the hospital because it's, it's dangerous for them. So yeah, they can be, if they get registered with us, then they will be given those numbers.
Okay. So one more thing now, since we're talking about the emotional aspects of some patients. As a patient, actually, when you know that, everybody knows that we are going to die, but somebody who's in the very, very advanced stage of the disease obviously feels it's going to be any day, and every day is a bad day.
Yeah.
So they go through stress and they go through a lot of emotional upheaval.
Absolutely.
How do you deal with that, or how would you suggest one can deal with that?
Okay, so I think dealing with the emotional stress is part and parcel of what palliative care is about. And therefore, the first thing that we always do is to tell ourselves, when you're going into an interview with a patient and family members. To go back to the beginning, most of the family members don't want to tell the patient anything. They want the patient to be kept aside. And therefore, what we try to do is we try to help the family members, first of all, to understand that I'd like to speak to all of you together. And I'm not going to tell the patient to his face, oh, you're not going to be cured of your disease, but we are going to go by the general principles as to what the patient knows and what the patient wants to know. So if possible, this family meeting, as we call it, would be with the patient and the family. If not, then we'll try to talk to the family members first, again, about what are they also stressed about? What do they think they want to achieve? Is it possible? If not, what is achievable? And then let's concentrate on what is achievable and provide them the emotional support. The family members are again the same thing. So then, to the patient. So now if you're talking to the patient, we have explained to the family members that, okay, we're not going to give him anything that he doesn't want to know. We're not going to break her or his heart. We're just going to go by what the patient, because the question you asked was about stress. So as we all know, not knowing something causes more stress than knowing something which is bad. So we just try to understand from the patient what is actually troubling them. What is it you want to know about your cancer? What is it what are the myths and misconceptions which you have, and can we clear it for you? What are you worried about? What's going to happen in the future? If you list to me the things that you think are going to happen, then we take each and everything that you think is going to happen and show you that there are hopes of many things in life. So it can be hope of less pain. It can be hope of a very good night's sleep. Hope of meeting many loved ones that I would like to meet, because people think cancer is contagious and they should not come to me. And I would like to still meet so many things, so many people. It may be a brother is kept away from a sister because the parent thinks cancer is contagious. It may be, the fact that they don't know that they have a finite time and they haven't met a brother or a sister for a long time, and they would like to meet that brother and sister, or a mother or a father. So once we understand what is causing the stress, then we can go forward and take point by point and see which aspect of the stress can we elevate. And invariably, you will find that the stress is not only about have I got 10 years to live, but it is this many things that we can take care of. And if we can take care of 60% of their problem, then we have taken care of 60% of their stress. And I mean, this is an actual fact that once you've taken care of their pain or their breathlessness or their difficulty to sleep or their wound which is smelling or their pain, most of their stress has actually gone away, because actually we thought that they were scared of dying, but actually their stress was not about dying. Their stress was how many days I have not slept because of the pain. So an open discussion will take away at least 60% of the stress. And once the 60% is taken away, then you can address the 40%.
Yeah. I mean, there are strange things. Just a couple of days back, a lady had called me. Her mother was in the advanced stage of the disease. And, the lady was working somewhere earlier, but during COVID time, she's at home. And so she's, so she wants to go and be with the mother all the time. They live together.
Yeah.
But the mother says, all these years we live together, but you haven't spent time with me. So is it because I'm dying now that you want to spend time with me? So, those type of questions have come in the mind.
Yeah.
And they're like, watching. She said, don't watch with me because all these years you have not watched television with me. So suddenly, why do you want to watch? And the lady herself feels that, she feels guilty that the mother has got all these feelings about it. So it becomes a constant cause of friction and stress and all those things.
Yeah, so see, the way I would look at that is that if they are honest with each other right from the beginning, I think half the stress would go away. I mean, like that, and that's what, like I was talking about the children, it's the same thing with the adults. When they know something, they are way more resilient than what the family member thinks, because the family member is always going by the fact that I need to protect my person from any further stress. But actually, the stress is not knowing. The stress is not about the fact that, yes, anyway, I mean, most people are after the age of 70, they know they have to die sometime. They're not worried about the death. They're worried about, I shouldn't suffer. I don't want to have a pain, or I don't want to choke to death. I don't want to suddenly, cough up some copious amounts of blood. They're not worried about dying. They're more worried about the symptoms. And once you vocalize and give them an opportunity to open things up. So a lot of time we spend actually is in trying to open the doors between the patient and family. So that if everything is open and if you can discuss things which you think are taboo and actually they're not. I mean, why would I not be able to discuss dying with my mother if my mother wants to talk about dying? Why would I not be able to discuss it with my husband if my husband wants to know whether he's dying or not? So it's fear. Basically, the family members fear. And if we can be the conduit between those patient and family members and helping them to understand that death is part of living. And most of the time, it's not the death which they fear, it's the symptoms during the death. And if that's one thing if palliative care can do well, it is to take care of as many symptoms as possible towards the end of life. We have so many things. We have drugs, we have non-drugs, we have, there's a whole armamentarium that we have which we can take care of symptoms.
So Dr. Mukhadan, like you were mentioning earlier that people should use things like walker and wheelchair and all that. But very often I find there's a resistance to use those things because either you say I'll become dependent on that, not realizing at this age it doesn't matter whether you are using them and are dependent. They feel that the independence will go if they use these things. So is there something that you would like to tell patients if somebody is listening who has an adult patient at home on how to, why it is necessary to use these help which is available, these products that are available?
Okay, so let's look at it this way again. We're looking at quality of life. So we talked about right in the beginning. We talked about quality of life. So yes, though it is true. I mean, I don't blame. Let me bring my father-in-law back into the picture. He died at the age of 94. So he had that whole trajectory of first he could walk really well. Then he had a stick. Then he had the stick which had three, the tripod. And then he had a walker. And finally he became bedridden. So yes, I well understand your question because every time he would say, if I take to the stick, I'll never be able to use it again. Then how will I be able to go down the stairs because I fall? Then it became, how will I, if I use the walker? But, I think once you kind of persuade them to try it for a certain period of time, I always believe in one, I'm a firm believer that don't lie to the patient. So yes, it's possible that you may not be able to give up that stick. It's possible you may not be able to give up the walker, but you are not straining your knees, you're not straining your back, you're not giving more tension to the other joints in the body, in your body, which also need to be protected so that they will last you for a way longer period of time. So just try it for some time, and if you give them, I think, truthful explanations, then I think it's a question of they won't accept it the first time, they may not accept it the second time. But the third time round, it would be a question of they'd realize that they're saving their knees, they're saving the muscles of and the actual bones of the back, which again they need. So because otherwise, if they're not able to, if their bones of the back become too weak and become too osteoporotic, in other words, they become less calcium in the bones, then they're not going to be able to stand also. So I think everything is communication. It's basically communication, and also I have to bring in my pet topic here, and that is shared decision making. So the patient should be the person who makes the decisions for her or himself. If he insists that he's not going to use the walker, believe me, he'll try it out for some time, but when the walker is there and he's seeing that walker is kept, and I'm sure sooner or later she or he is going to think, okay, let me try it out. And then when they find that so much easier it is to walk, I think, I think that's human nature. If you tell someone to do something, they're going to say no. But if they try it out for themselves and they realize that it's better this way, I think they will come around to accepting it. It's the same thing with it's the same thing with the urinal or a commode. You don't want to use a urinal. You say, oh my God, it's so undignified. How can I do this? But then if it's there under the bed, I wouldn't be surprised if very surreptitiously, when everybody's sleeping, the gentleman is going to try to use it, or the lady is going to try to use the commode and realize that I didn't have to go to the bathroom and I didn't spoil my sleep. Actually, the quality of my sleep was much better that night.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. So one more question, Dr. Mukhadan, is about the insurance part of it. Do you have any specific information on insurance of people? Because once you have cancer, you can't get insurance in most cases.
Yes.
but do they give you the insurance money for palliative care treatment, products?
As far as my knowledge, I could be wrong, and I'll be more than happy to, if anybody finds out, it'll be good for everybody else also. But as far as I know, from what research I did, I don't think there is any insurance available for palliative care in general, because unfortunately, in our country in today's date, palliative care has not really been recognized as a super specialty. And that's what we palliative care people are fighting very, very, very hard in putting palliative medicine, not so much palliative care, but palliative medicine as one of the branches of medicine, like many, many other specialties. So if you have geriatrics and you have neurology and you have cardiology, then palliative medicine should be one of the specialties. Still that, I mean, it is because it's not that it's not there. We've started the first MD in the country in palliative medicine, but it's not something which the whole country recognizes as something which is there. And insurance companies are only going to take it up if it's going to be beneficial to them. So as we all know, there isn't that much which they spend on palliative medicine. They don't. They would like to spend on big things, and palliative medicine is about the cheapest branch of medicine there is, because we don't look for that high, that very high end consumer goods or medications. So whether a patient really requires to insure themselves for palliative medicine, it's an iffy thing. But I would still like to very much emphasize, in a country like ours, we must have insurance, whether it's to cover your palliative care needs, or whether it is to cover your geriatric needs, or whether it is to cover your cardiac needs or your respiratory needs. That's all part of palliative care anyhow. So you don't have to label it as palliative care. I think everybody must have an insurance. And when you have needs which could be all these other needs, so it's either a need of the cancer, or it's the need of the neurology, or it's, say it's for a stroke, or it's COPD, the patients who have respiratory problems, and for years together they have a difficulty, they need a lot of medication, they need nebulizations, they need a lot of aids. So I think patients should be insured for all these diseases, and palliative care is just a part of the treatment of those diseases. So I don't know whether we really need to have a separate insurance for palliative care. I don't know if I made myself clear. I don't hope the audience understood that.
Sum up the whole thing, I would say you said we need to palliate people because to give them a good quality of life, there should be open communication, there should be shared decision making, there should be insurance for everybody. We should understand in a group with the team of doctors to see what is the best to be done for the patient. So that is what the important issue is here. So those things I think have been covered extremely well, and I'm sure will go a long way. So coming to the end of the program, any one message that you would like to give to us as volunteers, or to people who have patients in the house who are on palliative care, to make life easier for everybody?
So I think maybe the message I really think I'd like to give everybody, all the volunteers, and of course everybody who's on this program and listening, is that palliative care is not end of life. Palliative care is actually a very positive ancillary aid to take care of a patient and their family when they are undergoing a life-limiting condition. So it's not the end of the world. It is something where a lot of relief can be given by our groups, not only in physical, but in psychological, social, and spiritual care. But it's only going to happen if there are more and more palliative care centers coming up in the city of Mumbai, in the country, so that all these patients, they will go through the same trajectory of illness. We are not going to change anything. We are not going to hasten death. We are not going to, use that dreaded word euthanasia. No, we are going to help the patient go through the same trajectory of illness. But what we are going to do is to make it easier for them. So please give us an opportunity to do that. And how will we get that opportunity is, I think, if patients and their families, so if anybody who's on this chat, You may know somebody who has a life-limiting condition, and doesn't mean the patient is going to die. It means that you have a chest which is, having chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, or you have a patient who's having a stroke, or you have a child who is having, say, cerebral palsy or mental retardation. We are there to help. We are not there to change the trajectory of illness. The patient will not die faster because we are along with them. The patient will have a better quality of life. And that's only going to happen, I think, if the public demands for more and more palliative care centers to be set up, for funding in hospitals, to have a palliative care unit in every hospital. I think we haven't talked about advanced directives. I'm not sure whether there was not enough time to bring up advanced directives, but I would just like to say that the Supreme Court of India in 2018 has given us a mandate that patients who want to have an advanced directive can, and that the hospitals have to respect that advanced directive, so that every person does not have to land up in the ICU and spend those huge amounts of money, which is going to be unnecessary if that's something which they do not want. And it's also going to help the doctors to realize that heart of hearts, I know that I can't do much for this patient, but if I don't put him in the ICU, then I may have a case against me, because end of life care does not exist in our country as a law. And that's why it's really nice that the Supreme Court has put up advanced directives. So any human being can have a living will, which can be signed and which can be kept with them. And the doctor is supposed to respect that. I'm not going into the nitty-gritty because it's not a very peaceful process as of now. There are a lot of things which need to be changed. There are a lot of things which need to be amended and made simplified. But at least that was one step in the right direction. And I think it's important for each and every one of us to know what we want to do when we reach that situation. Because that situation may be a fast one, or it may be a very slow one. But I think it's important for Vandana, for you and for me, to know how I want to die. It may not happen till 20 years from now or even 40 years from now. That's okay. But we should know how we want to die, and we should put it down. We should have an advanced directive, so that it makes it easy for our family members to respect it. It makes it easy for the doctor to know this was the patient's wish, and therefore I will not overstep and do unnecessary, and I'm emphasizing on the word unnecessary, interventions.
Dr. Mukherjee, we can't close the conversation without something on Ayurvedic, homeopathy, alternative and complementary, alternative, not complementary, because the moment people hear that it's going to be like, advanced stage, nothing will help, they're going to be giving medicines only to keep them comfortable, they turn towards Ayurveda and homeopathy and all other treatments possible. Do you have any advice for those people?
Okay, so let me put it this way. I think anybody who you tell not to take it is not going to listen to you. Because every patient who comes to us, every patient, especially the children, and we get a lot of children. As you know, my area of expertise is children's palliative care. So, everybody is going to try homeopathy and Ayurveda. And the only thing I always tell them is, please ask the person who's giving you the medication, what are they trying to elevate? Are they going to cure your cancer? In which case, please ask them for statistics. Because if they're giving you the free medicine, go ahead and take it. But if they're going to make you spend as much as you would have spent on chemotherapy, because some of the medications are not cheap, then you need to have a clear statistic from them as to what are the expectations, what are the hopes and expectations, and what is their actual experience. Because the only difference between alternative treatment and allopathic treatment is the fact that we have enough of research to give us figures. We can actually state facts and tell them that this is a percentage of cure. But Ayurveda and homeopathy cannot do that because they do not do adequate research. So if the person tells you, let's try for 3 months, and it's within your pocket and you're able to afford it, try for 3 months. If it's helping you, go for another 3 months. And if it's still helping you, then go for another 3 months. Don't take on board just like that someone telling you, I'll cure you of your cancer. Then please ask for statistics. if it's helping you, why not? You know, that's absolutely fine. I think anything is good. Even like, for instance, if a person's lungs are full of disease and there's no medication for that, please try, please try yoga, please try breathing exercises, please try postures, please try anti-stress measures. Anything which helps is perfectly acceptable.
Oh. Mukhadan, thank you very much. We're really, really grateful to you, and considering that you had a bereavement in the family just a couple of days back, he's here with us and talk to us. Really appreciate it. We're very grateful for that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vandana. Thank you very much. And to all your team and to all the people who are listening to us, thank you very much for a patient listening.
Thank you.
Okay. Okay. Bye-bye.